Hello, everybody. This is Bishop Barron. I know the lack of civility is a major problem in our political culture today. Everyone knows that. Can I tell you a quick story? I ran across this just recently. It was a documentary on William F. Buckley, who back in the 60s, 70s, 80s of the last century was probably the most prominent conservative commentator. And it was some kind of celebration of Buckley, a birthday or anniversary. And he had a series of speakers on. And, some of them were his allies ideologically, but he also had a number of people who were completely opposed to him ideologically, well known to be his public opponents. And they joked about their differences. But what was really interesting to me, and I thought, boy, we miss this today, it was also equally clear they were all friends. They were all friends, and their friendship, in a way, was far more important than their ideological differences. And what struck me as I watched it was, I don't know if that can happen today. I don't know if you'd see something like that. And that's a real loss in our public discourse. If we lose the capacity to have friendship, real personal connection, real love with people that we don't agree with, the problem is we identify disagreement ideologically with hatred. Even the way that word is thrown around in our culture, of hatred and fear. How about we disagree ideologically, but we can still be friends? That to me is the foundation for a democratic polity. If we lose that, we lose our way. So I would hope that as we look at these issues of religious liberty, of civility, of discourse, let's find that space where we can, even as we disagree, remain friends. If that stays in place, then we can make real progress in our civil society.
What will bring about real progress in our society? The ability to have civil discourse where we don't hate the other person because they disagree with us, or if they have a different ideological position, that means that they hate us. No, we can actually agree to disagree and actually be friends. And I would say that to be a friend is to will the good of another person, even if they disagree with you. Bishop Barron mentions that he has a pessimism about that actually happening within society. Hopefully, though, I think there is hope because I found a clip of Steven Crowder, who is a conservative pundit and comedian, having a dialogue around the violence, the political violence of the left. So this is a pretty serious issue, something it's a hot button topic within our culture of late. And I was pleased to find a very, very cordial discussion on a very, very hot button topic. Maybe there is hope that we can have discussions that are actually fruitful and beneficial. Why do I believe it was fruitful and beneficial? They define terms, they stick to the terms, they listen to one another, they don't really get mad at each other. Now, I'm just showing a clip of this conversation. Perhaps it did get a little bit off track um, later on, but at least in the beginning here, I think we had something of like a civil discourse. So I'm going to show this clip again. It went viral because it's very, very intriguing and interesting around the issue of political violence, especially within the left. Let's go ahead and watch it. I am going to interrupt it quite a bit because of copyright issues. Don't just so you know that's going to happen. I am going to interrupt it, but let's see what they have to say.
Before I get to the premise of today, could you do me a favor just so we can find some common ground?
Yeah.
This is what's being cited right now quite a bit. Just the definition of political violence. I want to make sure we both agree on it.
Political violence are criminal complaints, indictments, and court records looking for crimes that seek a socio-political change or to communicate to outside audience.
And I'll summarize it. That's the technical
Yeah,
description from the
okay.
source cited.
Yeah.
It's violence as a tool being used toward a political end. In other words, just because you vote Democrat or because you vote Republican, if you accidentally hit someone with your car and commit manslaughter, that's not political violence. If you
Okay.
vote Democrat, but let's say you go out and run someone over because of their politics, that would be political. Do we agree on that?
I think I can agree with you on that.
Okay,
Yes.
good. So the premise today is that particularly today in 2025, by and large, the political violence is coming from the left. It's not proportionate with that on the right. That's the reason for the security that you see today that's very necessary. And it's a problem that's reaching a boiling point that may not be sustainable. If you disagree with me, you're welcome to change my mind.
All right, so let's just summarize what is actually being defined here. Violence, political violence, is violence that is perpetrated because of a political affiliation. So, the main case, obviously, that's going to be made in conjunction with Charlie Kirk and Tyler Robinson is that Tyler Robinson was leftist and he did enact political violence because of he basically killed Charlie Kirk because of what Charlie Kirk believed. And as Bishop Barron said in the beginning, it's connected to this sense of if you have a certain ideology, that means you hate somebody or someone. Um, and that is the issue. So political violence is violence that is perpetrated in the name of your political affiliation and is specifically stated to be so. And the premise is that the left engages in more of this political violence. Okay.
I don't know if I can change your mind, because here's the thing. When I see the sign that says the left is violent, and
Yeah.
you talked about how it's not proportional, and I would love to see your statistics about that,
Sure.
because we could make the same statement about the right very easily, right? Like we could say that was it just a month or two ago that the Democratic lawmakers were shot, and that was like, all right. I think our bigger problem is that the
Talk about the
media-
Hortmans in Minnesota, right?
Right, yeah, because she was a senator, and her husband was also killed, and that was done by the right, whatever. But
It wasn't, but continue.
that wasn't a
No.
it wasn't a conservative or
No, that's why I used the example that I did. The person, Vance Bolter, who committed it, specifically said it had nothing to do with politics, and he left a letter reasoning it, saying that Tim Walz had ordered him to carry a hit out on people. So he was very clear that it wasn't in the name of politics. That's someone who happened to be, on some issues, Republican, on some issues, Democrat. And he was appointed by a Tim Walz administration. So that was not done in the name of political violence. He said Tim Walz ordered him to assassinate somebody who was out of his mind. But I'd like you to continue with the example.
Sure. And let's say, okay, so he wasn't right. That's fine.
No, it wasn't political violence.
Wasn't political. Oh, it didn't count as political violence.
Based on the definition
okay.
you agreed to, right?
Yeah. And I think a lot of it too is there's so many things happening. It's actually really hard to get all the facts about everything.
Sure.
And our media is when they make these statements, or they start to postulate about an event, and it will become political before we've even fully fleshed everything out. Like.
Could you give me an example?
Well, like the shooting that happened at the church yesterday, I haven't seen enough. I don't know. Have you seen any media on it yet? I'm curious to know what the media is saying
quite a bit.
about it, and I want to know how are they characterizing it?
Yeah, the media isn't characterizing, even I will say this, even on the left and the right, they're not really characterizing that as political violence.
Okay.
Because it was a guy who really seemed to harbor ill will toward the Mormon church. So it's pretty hard to categorize it as political violence when the targets were largely conservative, and the man who carried out the action seems like he might be a Republican.
All right. So the first kind of intuition I'm having with this, and I don't know if it favors the liberal lady in this conversation or this conservative pundit, Steven Crowder, hopefully I'm getting his name right, is it seems to me that to talk about violence of any sort in a political fashion and basically say that um, violence can be determined politically seems to be a form of political manipulation. Um, I think her question is good in the sense of how is it being characterized? Do we jump to conclusions too soon that something is violence in the political sense? And he talks about this Tim Walz situation and says that the violence was not political because he left a note saying that Tim Walz had actually asked him to assassinate somebody else. And then hopefully I'm understanding this. Tim Walz had asked this person to assassinate and ordered this person to assassinate another person. And so instead of assassinating the other person, he decides to kill Tim Walz. I think that's what happened. I think that's what he's saying. How is that not political violence? So, and he says political violence in the way that we've defined it. I think it would fit in the category just because somebody says that it wasn't because of his political affiliation necessarily being left or right, but it is connected to political plots of assassination, and therefore going back. I think historically that would be probably the perfect personification of what would be constituted as a political act of violence. A politician saying, or a Roman emperor saying to assassinate this person, and you assassinate them. Instead, what could be more politically motivated than that? I don't know. That's just my first initial take, is that to be to basically try to persuade somebody that a political party is more politically violent seems to be a political manipulative move that doesn't. Yeah, I think that's what I would say. Let's continue.
But I think we could pick a more clear example, a multitude of them. The reason we're here, and I don't think you would argue that this is unnecessary, the assassination in cold blood is an act of terrorism of Charlie Kirk. Is that political violence? You seem so confident on the Hortmans, but not Charlie Kirk.
I would say, I was just thinking about your question. Yeah, I mean, probably because he was like Turning Point USA is a conservative organization, right? That's meant to try and rally young conservatives and be involved. And so, yeah, I would probably agree that his death was political, or his murder, assassination was politically violent. But I guess I just have a hard time reconciling that with, we can say that the senator and her husband being killed wasn't political, but...
I'll tell you exactly why. I'll tell you exactly why. Because the express motive of the terrorist who assassinated Charlie Kirk was politics. He killed him because he said he's one of those hateful conservative right-wingers.
It doesn't necessarily mean that it was politically... It seems to me that if we're being true to the premise and definition, it doesn't necessarily follow that if somebody says he killed Charlie Kirk because of all of the hate, obviously you can make a necessary correlation between the political ideology and that hate, even as Bishop Barron said. But they are two distinct things. Like if somebody says, and I'm trying to be fair to the definition, if somebody says I'm killing them because I hate them, that is different than saying I'm killing them because they are conservative, right? And it seems to me that the Tim Walz example would flow and fit equally within this definition. Are you tracking with what I'm saying? Let's continue.
The rhetoric that he espoused, the reason that he killed Charlie Kirk, was to take out someone of his political persuasion and make others of his political persuasion afraid to express their opinions. The man who assassinated, which I roundly condemn, Vance Bolter, the Hortmans, did not do it as a means to a political end. Charlie Kirk was assassinated, he is not an elected official, solely because of his political perspective as a method to instill terror in the populace.
Yeah.
How do I know? Because a person said it was political violence.
Okay, what if we just don't even have enough information, though? Like, what if it is politically motivated and we just don't have enough to know about it yet?
In that case, we do.
Well, not in this particular instance, but I just mean like with the Hortmans you mentioned.
Okay, well, let's separate the gray area.
Okay.
Right, that's why I kind of start with the example. Just because you, I would assume, let's say vote Democrat or Republican, just because you commit a crime doesn't make it political violence. I mean, if we did that, we'd have 90% of the crime being committed on behalf of the Democrat Party because most people in inner cities vote Democrat. I don't consider that to be political violence. People have political beliefs, and people commit violence. Sometimes they rob a store because they want money. People who commit political violence do so specifically to instill fear in political opposition. They specifically commit violence as a means to a political end.
Okay.
And when we categorize it that way, it's overwhelmingly coming from the left. We do have the sources here that we make this available, so you can take the QR code. So what would make you, because you seem very confident that the Hortmans was political violence, and then it's nuanced with Charlie Kirk. Why?
Oh, I didn't say it was nuanced at all with Charlie Kirk. I agreed with you after considering your question that it was a political...
If that doesn't constitute political violence that could be answered in the affirmative immediately, of course, what would? Like, what would be required to say, oh, this is clearly an act of political violence or political terrorism, if not Charlie Kirk?
I agreed that it was political violence, so I'm not sure where this question's coming from.
Well, I'm saying because...
He's insinuating that she's trying to nuance her position on Charlie Kirk just because it took her 10 seconds to figure out how she wanted to respond to the question. This is kind of an ad hominem attack that is unfounded. And again, I know it sounds like I'm being critical of him. It just seems to me that it seems like a political attack. Obviously, political violence is not necessarily verbal because we do believe in this country that you can have the freedom of expression of your views. You should be able to speak, free speech, right? If I can get that out. But I don't think we should ever get to the point where we're intuiting certain perspectives that the person, just because a person takes 10 seconds to respond, doesn't mean that there's some crazy woke liberal. Get what I'm saying? Let's continue.
You came in and pointed to an example that would be in the gray area, the Hortmans, and took a long time to agree with that premise of Charlie Kirk. And so what if we don't know enough information? So Charlie Kirk would be very clear left-wing political violence.
Yeah.
Okay.
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 Sure.
Great.
Yes.
So there are more examples of that coming from the left than the right.
Than from
That's
the
the premise, yes.
Okay. So you're saying clear examples of political violence. I
Yes.
hear you using clear
Violence
examples.
carried out as a means to a political end.
So there's clear information, data that shows us that the left is violent or is more violent than the right.
Yes. Not only in crime statistics, but also in the polling after Charlie Kirk's death. Now, I believe that you're discussing this in good faith, and I would assume that you roundly condemn political violence of all stripes.
Of course.
So do I. Just to be clear, I think we both are. That's why we're sitting at a table having a conversation.
Right.
Do you identify as more liberal or conservative?
I like to think I'm moderate because I hold some conservative views and some liberal views.
Okay.
And I wish we could have a little bit more moderation in our country.
Like sitting down and having discussions?
Exactly.
Okay.
Like things like this.
Because we get killed for it anyway.
Right. Yeah.
And only the right. Only the right gets killed for this anyway. You're seeing the one that got through. The reason I stopped doing this for years is because every single time out was a violent attack. Sometimes it was a rock. Sometimes it was a milkshake, could be concrete, acid, chocolate, vanilla, I don't know. Doxing, fire bombings, Molotov cocktails. Maya Angelou spoke at SMU only a few years before my first time here, didn't need this kind of security. And you can see it if you observe your speakers here. And I'll tell you why that is. If you look at the polls post-assassination of Charlie Kirk, and you label yourself as a moderate, those who identify as liberal support political violence at a ratio of 6-1 to conservatives. The YouGov poll said, is political violence acceptable? 77% of conservatives said not at all. Only 38% of those on the left said not at all. 62% of those on the left said somewhat to completely acceptable. We see the same stats after the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. We see the same stats after the fire bombings of the Tesla dealership. And we see the same stats on the opposite side, those on the right roundly condemning political violence. The lowest you'll find is 72. You usually find it in the high 80s. You will not find a number that breaks half on the left.
All right, so we're just going to end it there. There's many things that I could say here. I do think that the premise that the left is more politically violent than the right, I think is probably true. It probably is true when you see what's going on in Portland or California, traditionally liberal zones, they are more violent. Inner cities, which are traditionally more liberal, are also more violent. I think that there is a good case study, there is good results, some social sciences going on here that the political ideology of liberalism, which is really tethered to Marxism, relativism, a view of individual expressivism, culture of self invention, as Bishop Barron talks about, leads you to not, becoming subservient to some objective standard of moral right and wrongs and duties. It can kind of be whatever you want it to be. And I think that, yeah, that way of thinking will always lead and tend towards um, more violence in the outward manifestation of that violence. And this is the daily dose of Christ, and that's where I want to connect. How are we to think about this from a Christian Christological standpoint? And I want to connect it this way. The issue is much deeper than any of us could ever imagine. Jesus said, out of the heart, the mouth speaks. It is from the inner man that all forms of outward violence, malice, hate flows, right? And so Jesus also talked about that to hate your brother is to murder them, right? And so I think it's important that we see, at least from a Christocentric Christian worldview, that if you're shooting people, obviously that's violence. But also, if you have disdain, if you don't care, if you don't have empathy, if you don't have long suffering and patience, if you're willing to condemn and condone and slander, that equates in Jesus's estimation to murder itself. And so we need to get to the point where we're not trying to persuade people towards an either or, but we're pointing either or being a liberal or conservative political ideology, but we're pointing people to Christ, who I would agree with this lady. Obviously, she's not liberal, as I said, she's a moderate. She's probably more liberal, let's be honest. She wouldn't be there talking to him if she wasn't. Um, that we do need a via media moderate approach. And of course, the Christian faith, I think, offers it. It allows you to hold a traditional moral and objective, um, an objective outlook on an objective philosophy, really. But it also calls you and summons you as an individual to um, do for others what they cannot do for themselves, to love them even if they return with hate and violence, to love your enemies, as Jesus said. So it's a via media that we have to approach. And I think to side on one political spectrum over another is to untether yourself from some principles that Christ would be preaching. So the reality is that both the left and the right of Jesus were crucified on the cross, and to not side one way or the other ultimately gets you killed in this world. Perhaps Charlie Kirk is a personification of that because he was kind of a via media person, even though he often found himself in political and polemical situations with young people on the radical left. But what I think you can see is that when you get two people that are not radicalized one way or the other, I actually think this guy is more radicalized than this lady is. But you can have a civil discourse. You can have a cordial conversation. So, is there hope, to get back to Bishop Barron, is there hope that our society can have these types of conversations? Obviously, I think we can. I think that this conversation, even over this very hot button topic currently with political violence and because of what has happened in many different cases, for example, the shootings at an Annunciation Church, or Tim Walls, which I probably needed to study more before I made some comments on that. If I misquoted or misinformed some of that, the perspectives going on there, some of the facts in that situation, let me know. But we basically we should have hope that civil discourse can happen as this country gets farther away from the radicalized perspectives on both sides. Um, I think we should be hopeful, even though many people are pessimistic that it can't actually get back to that. I think we should be hopeful because I think that Christ saves, and I think that Christ is still a fundamental part of this country, whether you believe that or not. Obviously, in a theological sense, he has complete reign and control over this entire world, and since that is the case, I think we should be expectantly hopeful in the immediate and obviously in the eschatological future that things are going to work out for the better. I don't know. At least it can happen one conversation, civil discourse at a time. And I think we saw that in this clip. All right. Let me know what you think. This is the Daily Dose of Christ. And Christianity is about him after all. And not only Christianity, but truth in general. Everything in this world, every thought that you have, every action that you enact ultimately comes back down to and into relationship with the God of this universe as personified in Jesus Christ. See you in the next one. Peace.